So again, good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be here with you today discussing a topic that is not just academically significant, but profoundly personal, deeply structural, and urgently relevant. We like to believe that economics is neutral, that markets function independently of history, race, gender, or social structures, rewarding talent, effort, and innovation. But if that were true, let me ask you this. Why do the same groups remain at the bottom of the economic hierarchy, generation after generation? Why is that, despite making up 56% of Brazil's population, Afro-Brazilians earn less, own less, and have less access to economic mobility than their white counterparts? Why is that, despite Brazil being home of one of the largest pride parades in the world, transgender people still face an unemployment rate of over 70%, with many forced into informal and precarious labor simply to survive? If the market truly operated on merit, why is that the distribution of wealth, land, and opportunity in Brazil, just like in so many other parts of the world, still mirrors the hierarchies that were built under colonialism and slavery? I think that the answer is clear. Economic systems are not neutral. They never have been. They are built upon histories of exclusion shaped by social hierarchies and designed to concentrate power among the privileged white, marginalizing those without it. So today we are going to deconstruct this illusion of neutrality and examine the intersection of race, sexuality, and market dynamics in Brazil. We will uncover how historical injustice shape modern economic realities. And we will look at hard data, not myths, not assumptions on who benefits and who is left behind. And finally, I think that we'll discuss what it takes to redesign an economic system that does not simply include marginalized groups, but actively dismantle the barriers that keep them excluded. Because economic injustice is not inevitable. It is a choice. And if it is a choice, then it can be changed. So let's begin. So you can find my Instagram, my LinkedIn if you want to connect. So to understand a little bit of the economic inequalities that exist in Brazil today, we'll have to look back, way, way, way back, because inequality doesn't emerge out of nowhere. It is designed, reinforced, and sustained over the generations. Brazil holds a singular haunting distinction in history. It was the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery in 1888. For over 350 years, its economic engine was fueled by the forced labor of more than 4 million Africans. Can you imagine? The largest group of enslaved people brought to any country in the Americas. Take a moment to consider a little bit. 4 million human beings, the nearly 40% of all Africans traffic across the Atlantic, forced from their homes, their cultures erased, their bodies brutalized, their labor extracted to build wealth, but not for themselves, for a colonial elite. And then suddenly in 1888, it was over. But what does freedom mean when it comes without compensation, without land, without economic inclusion? What does it mean when the same plantation owners who profit from this slavery kept their land, their business, and their political power? Why Afro-Brazilians were just left with nothing? They said to the Afro-Brazilians, "Oh, you are free, you can go," but they didn't have anything. So let's be clear, slavery did not end in 1888. It was transformed. Overnight, the enslaved became free, but in a society that had no intention of integrating them. While European immigrants arriving in Brazil were given land and state-sponsored support, Afro-Brazilians were deliberately kept at the margins, pushed into informal labor, denied access to education, and forced into the favelas, which began to form in the late 19th century as a direct consequence of Black economic exclusion. So yet, despite this, Brazil has spent the last century promoting a national myth, the myth of racial democracy. This is the idea that, unlike the United States or South Africa, Brazil did not have a formal segregation laws, and therefore racism didn't exist in the same way. It is an idea that has been exported, reinforced, and celebrated. The image of Brazil as a racially mixed, harmonious nation, a place where race does not dictate one's opportunities. But I think this narrative collapses under the weight of evidence. Because while there might not have been explicit segregation laws, economic segregation in Brazil has always been a matter of policy. Consider this. When slavery ended in the United States, formerly enslaved people faced racial terror, yes, but also over time were able to acquire land, build wealth, and demand rights through an organized struggle. Through an organized struggle. In Brazil, land ownership remained the privilege of the elite. And even today, more than 45% of Brazil's arable land is owned by just 1% of the population. That is a direct legacy of colonialism and exclusion. The effects of slavery did not disappear in 1888. They were formalized into economic structures that persist to this day. So let's talk about labor markets. In early 20th century, the Brazilian government actively encouraged European immigration, offering states subsidies, land, and job to Italians, Germans, and Portuguese workers. Can you imagine for what goal it was? To whiten the population and workforce. But meanwhile, Afro-Brazilians were shut out, denied the same opportunities, and confined to the lowest paid, most precarious job. These racial hierarchies have never disappeared. They evolved, embedded in the very foundations of Brazil's economy. Today, white Brazilians earn an average of 74% than Black and brown Brazilians. Black and brown Brazilians remain underrepresented in formal employment, higher education, and political leadership, while being overrepresented in precarious, informal labor, and in the country's prison system. So if Brazil were truly a racial democracy, wouldn't we see equality in the numbers? Wouldn't we see Afro-Brazilians holding the same economic power as their white counterparts? Wouldn't we see equal access to education, employment, and wealth? But we don't. And that is because economic policy has never been neutral. It has actively prioritized one group while systematically excluding another. The historical legacy of slavery is not a chapter in the past. It is an ongoing reality. The structure of Brazil's economy today was built on that foundation. And unless we acknowledge this history and its impact on the present, we will continue to reproduce the same inequalities over and over again. So the question is not simply what happened in 1888. The question we must ask is, what has been done since 1888 to correct these injustices? And as we will see, the answer is unfortunately very little. What was once an explicit system of racial exploitation became an economic structure that continues to privilege whiteness while marginalize Black, brown, and indigenous communities. The names have been changed, but the mechanisms have changed, but the outcomes, they remain eerily familiar. This is where the conversation must begin, because without understanding the origins of economic exclusion, we cannot begin to dismantle it. So moving forward. So the economics of race in Brazil. We often hear that numbers don't lie, that data is objective, free from bias. But numbers alone do not tell the full story. They not exist in a vacuum. They reflect choices, historical choices, policy choices, economic choices that have been shaped who has wealth, who has power, and who remains excluded. So let's talk about numbers. White Brazilians earn on average 74% more than Black and brown Brazilians. The wealthiest 10% of Brazilians, overwhelmingly white, control nearly 60% of the nation's total income. Meanwhile, Black Brazilians are 50% more likely to be unemployed than white Brazilians. But let's pause for a moment, breathe, and really think about what that means. Imagine two children born on the same day in Brazil. One is white, the other is black. Statistically speaking, before either of them has even spoken the first word, the white child is already more likely to have access to the better healthcare, better schools, better job prospects, and intergenerational wealth. The black child, meanwhile, is statistically more likely to grow up in a low-income household, face racial discrimination in hiring, and encounter systemic barriers that limit economic mobility. This is not just about individual ambition. It's about who works harder. It's not about who works harder. It's about historical accumulation of advantage and disadvantage. So taking education as an example, only 18% of Black Brazilians complete university compared to 36% of white Brazilians. Is this because Black students are less capable, less intelligent, less ambitious? Of course not. This gap is not about ability, it's about access. It's about how, for generations, Black children were placed in underfunded, overcrowded schools while wealthier, predominantly white families could afford private education that fast tracks their children into elite universities and high-paying careers. It is about how the lack of Black professors, Black professionals, and Black mentors in leadership positions reinforces the idea that success is not meant for them. It is about how a young Black student can graduate at the top of their class, but yet still struggle to find employment because of the last name, their accent, or simply the color of their skin makes employers question whether they fit in corporate spaces. And there is land, the foundation of wealth in every society. In Brazil, 1% of landowners control 45% of the country farmland. Meanwhile, quilombola communities that are made from descendants of enslaved Africans who escaped and built settlements are still fighting for legal recognition of their land more than 130 years after the abolition. So think about that. The descendants of people who were stolen from their homelands, forced to work without pay for centuries, who built Brazil's agricultural economy with their bare hands, are not being forced off their ancestral lands to make room for agribusiness, cattle ranching, and extractive industries. And when they protest, when they demand recognition, they are met with violence, intimidation, and bureaucratic delays that benefit the wealthy and the powerful. So when we look at disparities in wealth, income, and opportunity, we need to be clear about one thing. This is not random. These inequalities are not accidents of history. They are policy decisions, decisions that have been reinforced. Who gets access to land, capital, and education, and security, obviously, and who remains trapped by the cycles of poverty. Now, there are people who will argue that this is just how economies work. The markets are naturally favor those who are more productive, more qualified, and more capable. But let's ask a simple question. If markets are so efficient, why do they constantly fail the same groups of people? If meritocracy were real, wouldn't we have seen a greater economic mobility for Black and indigenous Brazilians by now? Wouldn't we see equal land distribution, equal wages, and equal access to capital? The truth is, markets do not correct inequality, they deepen it. Unless there is more intentional intervention, unless policies are designed to dismantle structured barriers, the default setting of the market is to reproduce existing hierarchies. So let me be clear. Brazil is not unique in this. Globally, from the United States to South Africa, from the United Kingdom to India, we see the same patterns. We see racialized disparities in wealth, in employment, in education, because economic exclusion is not just about money, it's about power. It's about who gets to define the rules, who gets to inherit privilege while others inherit obstacles, who gets the luxury of believing their economic success is simply a matter of hard work, while others are forced to fight just to have a chance. And so, as we move forward in the discussion, I want to keep us in fundamental truth in mind. Economic inequality is not a glitch in the system, it is the system. But here's the thing about systems. They can be redesigned. And that is what we must now turn to. So now let's add another layer into this discussion, sexuality and gender identity. When the world thinks of Brazil and LGBTQ plus rights, we often see the bright lights of São Paulo Pride Parade. It's amazing. I've been there, ooh la 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 la. But one of the largest in the world. It is a country with the same-sex marriage. It is a country with legal same-sex marriage, transgender recognition policies, and a vibrant LGBTQ plus present in art, in media, and culture. But let's be clear about something. Visibility doesn't give and doesn't mean equal safety. Visibility does not equal economic inclusion. Because behind the parades, behind the rainbow marketing campaigns, behind the celebratory headlines, there is a far harsher reality. Brazil is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for LGBTQ plus people, particularly from transgender women. Among the countries account, it consistently ranks as the country with the highest numbers of trans mothers globally, with more than 130 trans people killed in 2022 alone. But this violence is not just physical, it's economic as well. It is embedded in who gets hired, who gets promoted, and who gets access to financial stability and who is left behind. So let's talk about employment. Nearly half of the LGBTQ plus Brazilians have faced workplace discrimination. More than 70% of trans people are either unemployed or working informally, often in jobs with no security, no legal protections, and no benefits. And then there's corporate Brazil. Only 14% of Brazilian companies have clear anti-discrimination hiring policies. Sorry. That means the vast majority of employers in Brazil have no structured commitment to hiring and protecting LGBTQ plus employees. This is what exclusion looks like. Not just being denied of a job outright, but being subtly pushed to the margins, being overlooked for promotions, being placed in low-paying roles, being forced into sex work, street economies, and precarious jobs just to survive. And here's where we see the cruel irony of capitalism. The market welcomes LGBTQ plus people as consumers, but not as workers. It profits from pride merchandise, from rainbow themed advertising, from LGBTQ representation in media. That is what we call the pink economy, where businesses capitalize on the LGBTQ plus community without investing in their financial security. Think about it. During Pride Month, companies change their logos, launch LGBTQ plus campaigns, and sell products branded with rainbow flags. But how many of these companies are actually hiring LGBTQ plus employees in leadership roles? How many of them have trans-inclusive healthcare policies? How many actively protect LGBTQ plus workers from discrimination in the workplace? The answer is not nearly enough. Let's look at the numbers. A recently study by the Brazilian Institute of Geographic and Statistics showed that LGBTQ plus employees in Brazil earn, on average, 30% less than their heterosexual counterparts, even when they have the same qualifications and experience. Trans women, in particular, face near total exclusion from the formal workforce. In Brazil, it is estimated that 90% of trans women in major cities end up in sex work, not by choice, but because discrimination leaves them with no other options. This is not a coincidence. It is the direct results of policies that do not enforce anti-discrimination protections, of hiring practices that push LGBTQ plus people out of formal employment, of a culture that tolerates exclusion while celebrating visibility. And this exclusion begins really, really early. LGBTQ plus students in Brazil face disproportionate rates of bullying and discrimination in schools, leading to higher dropout rates, lower academic performance, and reduced access to higher education. So when people argue that market is neutral, I ask, how can the market be neutral when LGBTQ plus students are being pushed out of school before they even enter in the workforce? How can market be neutral when trans people are effectively locked down of formal employment? How can market be neutral when businesses profit from LGBTQ plus branding but refuse to create safe and inclusive workplaces? It is not neutrality. It's a structural economic design that prioritizes profit while ignoring that real economic vulnerabilities of LGBT communities. And so we must ask, what does real inclusion look like? It's not about representation in advertisements. It's not about pride sponsorships. It is about economic policies that actively break down barriers. It is about ensuring that LGBTQ plus workers are protected, are given opportunities, and are not forced into poverty because of their identity. And this means action. It means government policies that hold employers accountable for their discrimination. It means corporate commitments that go beyond marketing and into actual hiring practices. It means funding for LGBTQ plus entrepreneurship, access to capital, and economic mobility programs. Oh my God, I get so stressed with this. A little coffee. Because until economic policies prioritize real inclusion, the LGBT community will remain celebrated in advertisements, but excluded from economic security. And for me, and I think that for you as well, this is not inclusion. That is exploitation. So I'm going to ask you again, is this real inclusion or is this just another market-driven illusion? So when you talk about economic exclusion, we need to know that economic exclusion is not just about income, it's about survival. Because when you talk about inequality, when you talk about discrimination, we tend to focus on numbers, on wages, employment rates, access to education. But let's be absolutely clear. Economic exclusion kills. And nowhere in this is this more evident than in Brazil, a country where that year after year ranks at the most dangerous place in the world among that with the country's account to be a trans people. Again, 2022 alone, 131 trans people were murdered, many of them Black, poor, and living in the favelas. And those are just the reported cases. I think that you have the same question. We need to ask why? Because these deaths do not happen in isolation. They are not simply the result of random acts of violences. They are the direct, predictable consequence of economic vulnerability. Think about it. If you can't get a job, you can't afford housing. If you can't afford housing, you are forced into precarious, unsafe living conditions. And if you live in precarious conditions, you are exposed to more violence, more instability, and more risk. This is not a coincidence, it's a system. And it's a system that treats certain lives as disposable. So let's break it down. More than 70% of trans people in Brazil are unemployed or working in informal sectors, often in sex work, in street economies, in dangerous or unregulated industries. But this is not because trans people don't want to work. This is because discrimination at every stage of the hiring process exclude them. It starts in the childhood. Trans and LGBTQ plus youth face alarmingly high dropout rates due to bullying, lack of institutional support, and family rejection. Without access to stable education, they lose access to economic mobility before they even enter in the workforce. Then we think, and it comes the job market. A trans woman, even if she has the qualifications, will walk into a job interview and be immediately judged for her identity before her skills are even considered. Employers reject trans candidates at alarmingly high rates, often refusing to even interview them. And without employment, without access to stable income, many of them are forced to high-risk survival economies. This is why in Brazil, more than 90% of transgender women in major cities end up in sex work. Not out of choice, but out of necessity. And the moment a society forces a group of people into margins, it increases their vulnerability to violence. But now let's think about this on a structural level. Who are the people most at risk of economic exclusion? Black Brazilians, indigenous Brazilians, LGBTQ plus Brazilians, people who sit at multiple intersections of marginalization. So it should not be a surprise to us when we look at the statistics of who is most affected by violence, it is the same groups that are most affected by economic exclusion. In Brazil, 75% of the homicide victims are Black. In Brazil, Black women are twice as likely to be murdered as a white woman. In Brazil, trans women have a life expectancy of just 35 years. Now let's stop for a moment and really sit with that. 35 years. That is not just a statistic, that it's an indictment of an entire system. Because when people don't have access to stable jobs, when they don't have access to housing, when they are pushed into dangerous forms of labor, they are put in situations where their lives are more precarious, more unstable, and more at risk. And yet, when these deaths happen, when trans people, Black people, LGBTQ plus people are murdered, it is often framed as an issue of criminal violence, as if it is separate from the economy. But how can we separate them? When the structures of exclusion force people into vulnerability, they're creating the very conditions for violence to thrive. That is economic violence. And economic justice is not just about lifting people out of poverty. It's about ensuring that people have the ability to live freely and safely. Because let's be clear, when you deny a person access to a livelihood, you deny access to a life. Economic policies are not just about who makes money, they are about who gets to survive. And until our policies, our institutions, and our economies are designed with that reality in mind, we will continue to see the same cycles of exclusion, the same cycles of violence, the same cycles of death. And that is a cost that no society should be willing to bear. So let me ask you this. If we know that economic exclusion is lethal, what will take for us to stop treating it as an economic issue and start treating it as a human rights emergency? So far, we've talked about economic exclusion, race, and LGBT marginalization. But now we need to add another urgent layer to this conversation: land, labor, and the environment. Because when you talk about economic injustice, we are also talking about environmental destruction. The climate crisis is not just about rising temperatures. It's about who suffers the most, who profits the most, and who gets displaced the most. In Brazil, economic inequality is directly tied to who owns land, who controls natural resources, and who is forced to migrate as a result of environmental destruction. So let's break it down. So agribusiness displacement. Look at this image. It is, just a second, I'm sorry. So look at this image. This is the Amazon. Lush, lush, green, full of life, the lungs of the planet. But look closer, what do you see? You see scars, patches of land stripped bare, where once there were forests. And these scars are not just environmental problem, they are an economic and racial injustice problem. Because here's the reality, 45% of the deforestation in Brazil occurs in indigenous land. So let that sink in. Nearly half of all deforestation is happening on land that belongs to indigenous communities, Afro-Brazilians, quilombola communities, and traditional rural populations. And why? Because agribusiness corporations, cattle ranchers, and illegal lodgers are pushing people out of their homes to make way for profits. And this is not just about cutting down trees. This is about a system where those who with the least power, indigenous groups, black rural farmers, are being forced off their land so that handful of elites can expand their business empires. This is what economic violence looks like. Climate change and social inequality. So let's talk about climate change, because when we often hear that climate change is a global issue, that it affects everyone. But here's the truth, not everyone is affected equally. Marginalized groups, especially Black, Indigenous, and poor rural communities, are disproportionately impacted by climate disasters. So think about droughts. When extreme droughts hit, they don't just affect the environment. They destroy small farms, push people into poverty, and force families to migrate to urban areas where they struggle to find stable work. Think about flooding. Every year, floods displace thousands in Brazil. I can say about myself, my building, we had to move out in 2020 because of a flood. And I come from a middle-class family. Imagine, but look who is most affected. It's not about the wealth. It's about those in high-rise apartments. It's about people in precarious housing, informal settlements, and in flood-prone areas. And let me ask you something. When disaster strikes, the government response is slow, business continue as usual, and those who were already vulnerable become even more vulnerable. So this is not just about climate change. This is climate injustice. Because let's be honest, right? Who is responsible for the majority of pollution and deforestation? It's not the Black farmers. It's not the indigenous families. It is large corporations, agribusiness giants and industries that extract resources without accountability. But yet, who pays the price? Who loses their homes when forests are cleared? Who is forced to migrate when droughts destroy their crops? Who suffers the health consequences of toxic industries? It is the marginalized communities. Wow, surprise, surprise. This is why we cannot talk about economic justice without talking about environmental justice, because land ownership, environmental destruction, and economic inequality are deeply connected. So let's talk about economic vulnerability and forced labor. Talking about labor, because when people lose their land, when people lose their homes, when they are forced into cities with no support, what happens? They become vulnerable to exploitation. They take whatever work they can find, often dangerous, low-paying industries. And here's something most people don't even realize. Brazil still has one of the highest rates of forced labor in the world. Sad, right? There are still 10,000s of people working in conditions of modern slavery, particularly in agriculture, cattle ranching, and deforestation industries. And who are the most vulnerable to these exploitative practices? Once again, surprise, surprise, it is Black workers, indigenous workers, and migrants who were forced off their land by climate destruction, agribusiness expansion. So let's organize a little bit everything that I said. This is the cycle of exclusion. Land is taken from the marginalized communities. They are forced into informal or low-paying jobs. They have no legal protections or economic stability, and the cycle continues, benefiting the same wealth elites. And again, what is the government doing? In many cases, it is siding with agribusinesses. Environmental regulations are being weakened. Indigenous land protections are under attack, and the interests of corporations are prioritized over the rights of the communities. But as I say normally, the horrors persist, but so do we. People are still resisting. Afro-Brazilian quilombola communities are fighting to defend their land. Indigenous activists are risking their lives to stop deforestation. Grassroots environmental groups are exposing the industries responsible for climate destruction. And these fights are not just about the environment. They're about who controls land, who has economic power, and who gets to survive in a rapidly changing world. So let's be clear. The fight for economic justice is the fight for environmental justice. The fight for environmental justice is a fight for land sovereignty, labor rights, and racial equality. And the question is, whose side are we on? Because staying silent means choosing the side of those who profit from destruction. And history will remember which side we stood on. One second, people. I get so stressed with this topic. Just a second. So, Afro-Brazilian feminism and economic resistance. When we talk about economic exclusion, when we discuss inequality, we must ask, who is at the very bottom of the hierarchy? Who faces the greatest barriers? Who is excluded not just because of their race, not just because of their gender, but because the intersection of both? In Brazil, the answer is clear: Black women. Because if economic inequality is a system, then Black women sit at the point where multiple forms of discrimination collide. They experience triple discrimination: racial, gender, and class-based exclusion. And yet, despite these barriers, despite centuries of exclusion, Afro-Brazilian women have not only survived, but have led some of the most powerful movements for economic justice in Brazil history. They're not just resisting, they are redefining the economy. So let's break it down. When we talk about triple discrimination of race, gender, and class, Brazilian women in Brazil face the worst economic outcomes across nearly every indicator. They're paid less, hired less, promoted less, and invested in less than almost any other group. Let's look at the numbers. Black Brazilians women earn on average 60% less than white men, even when they have the same qualifications. They are significantly overrepresented in informal labor, particularly as domestic workers, where wages are low and legal protections are weak. Can you guess how many percent of CEOs in Brazil are Black women? 2%. 2%. Let that sink in. The country where the majority of the population, make the reflection to see if it makes sense for you. The country where the majority of the population is Afro-descendant has an economic system where Black women are particularly invisible in positions of power. And do you think that's a coincidence? Brazil's labor market was built on racial and gendered exploitation. For centuries, Black women's labor was either forced or severely underpaid. After slavery, they were pushed into domestic work, caring for the homes and families of white elites while being denied access to education, land, and financial independence. Sorry. And here's what's most insidious. This pattern never fully ended. Even today, you have Afro-Brazilian women remain overrepresented in the lowest paid sectors, cleaning, caregiving, manual labor, while being shut off high-paying, high-status jobs. So economic mobility is not just about working hard. It's about who has access to capital, networks, and opportunities. And black women in Brazil have had to fight for every inch of space in an economy that was never designed for their success. So let's talk about the gender pay gap and the structural barriers. When you talk about black women earn 60% less than white men, what does that actually mean in daily life? It means that a black woman can work twice as many hours and still struggle to provide for her family. It means that wealth accumulation is nearly impossible. Nearly impossible because wages are so low that there is nothing left to save or invest. It means that black women are more likely to rely on public services, less likely to own property, and far more likely to be in economic precarity. So this is not about working harder. It is about who gets access to high-paying industries, who is supported in leadership, and who is given financial supports or financial opportunities to build businesses and generational wealth. Because when you look at who gets funding, the statistics are shocking. Less than 0.5% of venture capital in Brazil goes to black female entrepreneurs. So this is so shocking, I'm going to say it again. Less than half of 1%. Not because black women don't have ideas or businesses or ambition, but because investors, banks, and financial institutions do not see black women as part of the economic elite. And this is where economic resistance begins. Because instead of waiting for inclusion in a system designed to exclude them, black women in Brazil are creating their own economic spaces. So we talk about black women redefining the economy in response to centuries of exclusion. Black women have built some of the most powerful economic justice movements in Brazil today. I'm going to talk about Preta Simoa. That's a national network of black entrepreneurs. Preta Simoa exists because traditional banks do not invest in black women. It provides microloans, mentorship, and business supports to black female entrepreneurs who have been historically denied capital. It's creating a new economic model, one that does not wait for the existing system to change, but builds alternative financial ecosystems where black women are the priority and not the exception. And then there is the Odara Institute, which is transforming how black women access financial education and empowerment, because financial literacy is still a power. It teaches women how to navigate the banking system, how to access loans, how to grow wealth, not just for themselves, for their communities. And let's not forget the work that being done by Afro-Brazilian feminist collectives in political spaces, because economic justice is not just about money, it's about policy. Afro-Brazilian women have been at the forefront of pushing for equal pay laws, stronger labor protections for domestic workers, racial and gender representation quotas in government and businesses. Of everything that I said, here is what we must remember. When black women fight for economic justice, they're fighting for everyone. Because when black women have economic power, it transforms families, because women reinvest in education, in instability, in opportunity, communities, because financial independence creates local wealth and employment, and nations, because economies grow when exclusion is replaced with inclusion. Economic resistance is a blueprint for the future. So all these movements that I mentioned, Preta Simoa, Odara, and Afro-Brazilian feminist collectives are doing more than fixing broken systems. They are building new ones. Because here's the reality: if the current economic system worked for Black women, it would work for everyone. If we had an economy where Black women had equal pay, equal access to capital, and representation in leadership, then we would have an economy that is truly just, truly fair, and truly inclusive. This is what economic resistance look like. And this is what Afro-Brazilian feminism is demanding. So the question that we must ask ourselves is not just how do we support these movements, but rather, how do we ensure that economic justice for Black women becomes the foundation of a transformed economy for all? Whew. So, for generations, economic exclusion in Brazil has been systematic and intentional. It was not just an accident, it was built into the structures of the society. But if exclusion is intention, then inclusion must be also intentional. The question is, what policies can actually drive economic justice? Because the market alone will not fix this. The free market has never been free. It has always been controlled by those with power. And if you want real economic inclusion, we need structural interventions. Let's look at 3 key policies that have been implemented in Brazil. The first one, affirmative action in higher education. The second one, hiring quotas for Black Brazilians. And the third one, LGBT anti-discrimination policies. Each of these policies shows both the possibilities and the limitations of the government interventions in economic justice. So let's start with affirmative action in universities. For decades, Brazil's public universities, the most prestigious in the country, were dominated by white students from wealthy backgrounds. Why? Because access to higher education was not just about talent, it was about privilege. Public universities in Brazil are free. I studied in a public university, but their entrance exams are highly competitive. Wealthy students could afford private tutors, top-tier high schools, and test preparation programs. Meanwhile, Black and low-income students educated in underfunded public schools were left behind. For you to have an idea, I am in my class of law school. There were 200 seats. In my class, there were 5 Black students counting me in 200. This meant that the public universities funded by taxpayers were effectively serving the rich, while Black and indigenous students were shut out. Then in 2012, Brazil introduced racial and socioeconomic quotas for university admissions. And the impact was immediate and profound. University enrollment for Black students increased by 60% in just a decade. Think about that. That is hundreds of thousands of Black students gaining access to higher education for the first time in their family history. I am the first one in my family to attend a university. There is an entire generation breaking cycles of exclusion, gaining degrees, entering professional fields, and increasing their economic mobility. This proves something essential. Economic injustice is not inevitable. When governments intervene, the results are tangible. But then here's a challenge. Affirmative action got Black students through the doors of university, but it didn't dismantle the racism in job marketing, in the job market. Which brings us to our second policy, hiring quotas. Representation in the workforce. In 2014, 14, Brazil took another step toward economic equity and justice. It introduced a federal hiring quota requiring that 20% of the government jobs must be allocated to Black Brazilians. Some of you that might think, why was this necessary? Because even with degrees, Black professionals are still being shut off leadership positions. The corporate world with the judiciary and the government institutions remained overwhelmingly white. The hiring quota was designed to break this cycle, to ensure that Black professionals had access to stable, well-paying jobs that historically exclude them. And again, the numbers speak for themselves. Since the introduction of the policy, thousands of Black professionals have been placed in government roles. Representation in the civil society has increased significantly, creating a ripple effect of inclusion in public administration. But once again, we must ask, does hiring quotas alone fix the problem? What do you think? No, because private sector discrimination remains widespread. Corporations, law firms, and banks are not subject to the same hiring quotas. And as a result, Black professionals are still underrepresented in the corporate leadership. So while the public sector is making progress, the private sector continues to reinforce racial barriers, which brings us to the final policy area. LGBTQ plus policies, inclusion without enforcement. Brazil has some of the most progressive LGBTQ plus laws in the world. Same-sex marriage, legal. Trans people can legally change their gender without medical intervention. An anti-discrimination law existing on paper. But here's the problem. Laws mean nothing if they're not enforced. Even though LGBTQ plus workers are legally protected from discrimination, enforcement is weak and inconsistent. Nearly half of LGBTQ plus employees report workplace discrimination, yet very few companies face legal consequences. And when LGBTQ plus workers win lawsuits, the legal process is long, expensive, and exhausting. And the result, many LGBTQ plus people choose not to report discrimination at all because they know the system will not protect them. This is what happens when inclusion is written into law, but not actively upheld by institutions. So while legal protections are a step forward, they must be paired with real enforcement mechanisms, corporate accountability, and cultural change. So the bigger lesson, policies must be structural, not symbolic. Each of these policies, affirmative action, hiring quotas, and LGBT protections, prove one key point. Economic justice does not happen by accident. It happens through policy. But policies alone are not enough. They must be enforced, they must be expanded, and they must be paired with larger structural changes that tackle the root causes of exclusion. Because what happens when affirmative action gets Black students into university, but the job market still discriminates against them? What happens when hiring quotas place Black professionals in public service, but corporate Brazil refuses to diversity? What happens with LGBTQ plus workers have legal protections, but workplaces do not implement real inclusion policies? Again, the answer is clear. Change must be systemic, not symbolic. And so on. And so the challenge before us is not just to pass progressive laws. It is to dismantle the economic structures that make those laws necessary in the first place. So I want to leave you with this question. What would an economy look like if inclusion was the foundation, not just a legal requirement? Because that is the future we must fight for. So, for too long, we have accepted economic systems as fixed, unchangeable realities. And we are told that capitalism is the only way, that markets must function as they do, that wealth inequality is an unfortunate but necessary consequence of growth. But what if that isn't true? What if we stopped trying to include marginalized communities within an already broken system and started redesigning the system itself? What if the measured economic success is not just by profit and GDP, but by well-being, sustainability, and justice? So I think that it's time to rethink economics from the ground up. And that means three key shifts: alternative models of economic organization, economic justice as a measure of success, and inclusive banking and access to capital. Each of these is not just an idea. They're real existing alternatives that are already being built. So let's explore them. First one, alternative economic models, land reform and sustainable agriculture. The first step toward economic justice is changing who controls the land and resources, because land is not just geography, it's power. In Brazil, 1% of landowners control nearly half of the country's farmland. Meanwhile, millions of small farmers, indigenous groups, and quilombola communities are fighting for land rights, often agribusinesses corporations that put profit above people. Land reform is not just about redistributing land. It is about shifting the entire agricultural system towards sustainability and justice. So let's take the landless workers movement, MST, in Brazil, one of the largest social movements in the world. MST does not just occupy land. It builds cooperative, community-run farms that operate outside of traditional capitalist structures. These farms produce food sustainably, provide direct employment for rural families, resist corporate land concentration. So this is what economic models look like. Alternative economic models look like. Models that prioritize human needs over corporate profits. And these models work. Agricultural cooperatives run by MST have produced over 25 million tons of food, feeding communities that are otherwise abandoned by the market. Just a second, people. This is not charity. This is a radical restructuring of land, labor, and economics. And it's proof that another way is possible. And now talking about economic justice, measuring well-being and not just GDP. Our second shift must be in how we measure this economic success. For too long, we have used the gross domestic product as the main indicator of progress. But GDP tells us nothing about who owns the wealth, how resources are distributed, and whether people's lives are actually improving. Brazil has one of the largest economies in the world, yet millions remain poverty, Black and indigenous communities remain excluded, and environmental destruction continues at catastrophic levels. So if GDP is rising but inequality is increasing, can we really call that success? Other countries are already adopting alternative economic measurements. Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index prioritizes well-being over production. New Zealand has introduced a well-being budget which evaluates how economic policies impact mental health, social equity, and climate stability. Ecuador, Buen Vivir, good living models promotes an economy-based community, sustainability, and collective welfare. Imagine if Brazil measures success not by how much wealth the top 1% accumulated, but how many people had access to education, healthcare, and stable employment. Imagine if well-being was the core of economic policy. This is not an utopian thinking. This is a necessary shift if you want a future where economic justice is real, not just an aspiration. And if you talk about inclusive banking, giving credit access for Black and LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs, is the third shift would be the access to capital, because economic justice is not just about having a job, it's about having the ability to create wealth. Right now, Black and LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs do not have equal access to financial resources. So let's talk about numbers. Less than 0.5 of venture capital funding in Brazil goes to Black-owned businesses. LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs face systematic barriers in securing business loans. Traditional banks continue to deny credit to small-scale community-led enterprises. And this is a deliberate economic gatekeeping system. But what happens when we change who controls banking credit? In Kenya, a digital bank system called M-Pesa has provided millions of unbanked people with access to financial services, completely bypassing traditional banks. In Brazil, we are seeing the rise of community-led financial cooperatives designed to serve Black, Brown, Indigenous, and LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs who are ignored by mainstream banks. And these models prove something very powerful. When financial power is placed in the hands of excluded communities, economies transform. Imagine a Black-owned, community-run bank that prioritizes loans for Black and LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs, funding for cooperatives and alternative economies, support for social enterprises focused on economic justice. And this is not just theory. These models already exist in pockets around the world. The challenge is scaling them up, investing in them, and ensuring they are not just alternatives, but the future of finance. So let's ask ourselves, what if instead of trying to fix the current system, we build an entirely new one? An economic model that prioritizes land justice, measured the success through well-being, and redesigned banking to serve excluded communities. Because economic justice cannot be achieved within a system that was designed for exclusion. We do not need more diversity within broken economic models. We need a new foundation for the economy itself. And that work has already begun. So the question is, are we willing to commit to this transformation? Because the future is not something we wait for, it's something we build. So, we have spent the last hour and a half, 62 minutes actually, breaking down the structures of exclusion, how race, gender, and economic inequality intersect in Brazil, and how the market reinforces this injustice, and how communities are resisting. But right now, we arrive at the most important question. What can we do about it? Because understanding inequality is not enough. Awareness alone does not create change. What creates change is action. And every one of us, whether as individuals, organizations, or policymakers, has a role to play in shaping the economy for justice and inclusion. So here are 3 concrete steps we can take right now. Challenge economic myths. One of the biggest barriers to economic justice is the myth that the free market is neutral. It is not. And the free market does not automatically correct inequality. In fact, it often makes it worse. We need to start challenge the myth of meritocracy, the idea that those who succeed simply work harder, while those who struggle are to blame for their situation. Because the truth is this: economic systems are not natural forces, they are human-made structures. And if they were designed to exclude, they can also be redesigned to include, right? This means that calling out false narratives about poverty, exposing how policies benefit the elite, and advocating for economic education that centers justice, not profits, Change begins when people understand the system and realize it can be changed. Individual actions matter, so we have to push for change, but systematic change requires policy shifts. We must demand policies that actively reverse structural exclusion, expand affirmative action beyond education and into corporate hiring, strengthen land rights for indigenous, quilombola and rural communities, enforce anti-discrimination laws, ensuring real penalties for businesses that exclude Black, brown, and LGBTQ plus workers, support economic policies that prioritize well-being, moving beyond GDP to measure justice, sustainability, and inclusion. Economic injustice is not just an accident. It's the result of deliberate policies. And the only way to correct is with equal, sorry, I get stressed. And the only way to correct is with equally deliberate policies that redistribute wealth, opportunity, and power. Policy change is crucial, but we need to support marginalized entrepreneurs. So is the redistribution of the economic power is crucial right now. And one of the most immediate ways to do that is through supporting Black and LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs. Every time that we choose where to spend our money, we are making an economic decision. So let's ask ourselves, are we supporting businesses that invest in marginalized communities? Are we using our purchasing power to redistribute wealth? Are we pushing for corporations to fund Black, brown, and LGBTQ plus startups, ensuring that these entrepreneurs have access to the same resources as their white male counterparts? Economic justice is not just about getting a job or in an unfair system. It is about creating new systems where marginalized communities own businesses, build wealth, and define the economic on their own terms. And this is how we shift power, by making sure that capital flows into the hands of those who have been historically denied access to it. So we are heading to the end, and I want to leave you with this. Economic systems are human creations. Their injustices are not inevitable. They're choices. And because they are choices, they can be changed. We are not powerless. Every policy we advocate for, every myth we challenge, every entrepreneur we support, these are the choices that shape the future economy. So the question is no longer, can we change the system? The question is, will we? Because history will remember what we chose to do in this moment. Change starts now. Tomorrow can be too late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, for the excellent presentation. But I do disagree with many of the proposed challenges because I see I address the issues, but I address it differently. I am more optimistic about the markets and the market solutions. But Canada's Economics Club always remains as a pluralistic space where people can express freely their views on topics and propose solutions, and we are all working towards better tomorrow. So that last point of yours, we are happen now. And also, especially with respect to land reforms, I guess that's a part of a historical injustice where there was historical violation of property rights. So it is very crucial to redistribute those lands which was a result of a violation of a property right. So I do believe in that aspect of it. As also you were pointing out towards the end, I guess correctly, you uh, said that like where you spend the money, that's what depends like the consumer part. I think then you affirmed the idea of pink capital or pink money, where pink money, like, so pink money is how we spend it. Like if the gay people, if the trans people, if the black people spend the money correctly, like at the correct places, that can make changes. So the market can do things. So it's about, yeah, right. You were like to point out, it's about educating people about these injustices and inequalities so that people act rationally, act more positively in the economy. Um, I'm very happy to have you, and this thought. It's wonderful to have you here. It's early morning for you, and it's afternoon for me. And I guess for people listening in, it's kind of late afternoon. It was wonderful. I don't see any particular questions at the moment. The recordings also we will be uploading on the YouTube channel of Cambridge Economics Club, and I will share it with you, Rodrigo. It is always a pleasure to have you and talk to you. It's like your presence itself is an amazing thing to have. Obviously, we have very opposing thoughts on certain ideas and economic proposals, but as I was reaffirming, Cambridge Economics Club always reform this pluralistic space where ideas come together, ideas get challenged and questioned. That's what it is important. This kind of space which we had in Salzburg, like the space where ideas go challenged, opposing people like opposing views come together. That's such a beautiful thing. Um, Rodrigo, do you have any final words?
I'd like to say like this. I think that the beauty of the discussion is not is not sharing the same ideas all the time, because
Yeah,
otherwise we cannot debate and create something that could include everyone in the room. So I admire your that you shared some thoughts, and then we already explained talked a little bit about it in Salzburg, and this is I think that these spaces where we can share our opinions, and then try to deliberate something that it's not on in every extreme, but in the middle, that no one can be left behind. This is very important, and it's always a pleasure to share the room with you. I would like to thank Kay and Raj Economics and Rethinking Economics for inviting me and for having me here, and sharing a little bit about my opinion about the situation in Brazil and the historical part. And I'm always open to discuss. Please, for the ones that are here or are watching the record, add me on LinkedIn. I can share, and we can share some thoughts and discuss a little bit more about the situation worldwide. Thank you very much, Vinayak, and you are a lovely person, and thank you very much for having me here.
thank you so much, Rodrigo. We would see you in future collaborations with a different topic. Also, just a reminder to the people who are attending next week, same time, we have another speaker. Amal Chandran will be joining us on the issues from India. So, once again, thank you, Rodrigo, and looking forward for more amazing stuff from you. See you and bye, all of you. See you. Stay tuned. Bye.
See you. Bye bye.